Hey everyone, it's Chad,
Hey, it's Khalil.
and we're the Martyrs of Truth. Alright, so to start off this episode, of course, we just like to recap what we did last. In our last episode and the one before it, we were recapping on some American speakers, some American presidents, really, in their points of views on how liberalism, one, should be supported, and two, should be furthered and brought upon as a system, throughout the world. Speakers such as Teddy Roosevelt, and then Franklin Delano Roosevelt after him espoused how freedom was something that should not just freedom in the liberal order was something that shouldn't just be limited to the United States. When there are atrocities, when there are autocrats, um, these ideas of freedom, of individual rights, of peace should be given to those people, or at the very least shown to them, because at the end of the day, these are the ideas that we as humans want and effectively need. Um, at the end of our last episode, we touched on how democratic nations just can't coexist with autocratic nations because those autocratic nations just don't work. I mean, if you have to raise a city in order, you have to raise a city to the ground, burn it to the ground, cleanse it with militias, bombs, everything, just to maintain order, I mean, you're probably doing something wrong. If you had to send millions of people out of society to gulags, to work camps, to concentration camps, I don't think your government's working really in the best way that it can. If you have to declare war against another country to, quote, unite your people and gain their loyalty, once again, it just in my point of view, it just, I would say objectively, I don't think your government is working in the best ways in order to support your people. If you have the need to persecute a minority in order to unite your own majority internally, that's not really the best way you're uniting your people inside your country. I think there's a better way to do that. And if your political system needs excessive violence to suppress all dissent, ideas, not just actions, but if you have to have agents always following back your people or sometimes just your leaders in general, if you have to have your KGB or your Gestapo behind everyone all the time in order to enforce a certain ideological view, your system is weak. If all you're doing is trying to fight others' freedom and trying to force your point of view, your government's worldview upon your citizens, you're not doing it right. The United States doesn't have to do that. We gave the people the ability to accept our system or not. We give the people the ability to protest us or to run for office and make our country better because that's at the end of the day what makes our nation strong. It's the ability for people to change our country whether they support it or not. They have the ability to change it, whether it's through speaking, whether it's through marching, whether it's through voting, whether it's through initiatives, propositions, impeachments. We give people the freedom to change the government how they see fit. And so that is why, unlike many nations throughout Europe who have fallen to socialism, to communism, to fascism, to dictators, we haven't done so in our 246 years. We may have had a civil war, but we have not fallen to these autocratic regimes. That is why, at the end of the day, we internally are strong because we give our people the freedom to support our nation, and so they will. Or and if they don't, they can make their country better how they see it. And at the end of the day, that makes it all better for everyone because we all have a say in how we fix our country and how we run our country going forward. That was my just kind of piece that I felt like we needed to really emphasize and we really wanted to include in that last part because that's why democracies can't coexist with these dictators. That is why FDR in 1940 in his speech was starting to recognize that the United States couldn't just sit on the sideline as Europe figured out its own problem, that the United States had to step in. And so this is where we get with the Cold War. As soon as World War II ended, The Iron Curtain fell, and a whole new war was started, an ideological one, between the liberal democratic order of the West, the United States and Western Europe, and the communist order of the East, of Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union, China, North Korea. This is where we are now, and now we'll get into some of the speeches of the leaders then and see how liberal democracy, I'd say, was strengthened and how it at least had to fight during this time to continue with the ideas that we as a liberal society hold so dear.
The world of 1945 was very sketchy, very tense, and everyone in the world knew it because with the communist slash in practice socialist, violent socialist even USSR, and the liberal democratic capitalist United States and both of their allies, they were competing with two different ideas of peace. After the long, long years and hard years of war in World War II, they wanted peace. They both thought they had equally good versions, and both of them believed that they were beyond each other, but they both had their own versions of how to keep the peace. Neither one of them, at least publicly, advocated for war. The USSR was beyond the days in 1918, 1919, 1920, 21, 22, in where they were advocating for the Comintern, the international communism. They were beyond that. They knew throughout the next 20, 25 years before World War II and during it that they were simply not going to push across the whole world. At least publicly, each side wanted to defend their own idea of peace. And that's why, with this new series, with this new, um, um, as we're getting to the very end of this Peace v. Freedom series, we're moving beyond the pre-Cold War era into the Cold War, which I'd like to call, and Chad would agree, the peace at war. And that's what we'll call this episode or two that we'll be talking about this. And the first speech that best brings forth, this idea of peace at war, two different versions of peace at war with each other, is Winston Churchill's Iron Curtain speech. So the U.S. has so much of a commitment, and Churchill talks about this a lot in the speech. But the U.S. has so much of a commitment to somehow achieving both peace and freedom that even when freedom abroad is being denied, they leave open every avenue of peace. America stood on the sidelines before the First and Second World War and cared little for human rights abuses abroad because of selfishness, as well as a recognition of our own faults and feeling that one need not judge what another does, but focus entirely on itself. America did not really want to go into war. No peace-loving people want war, but at least publicly, the the human rights abuses that were being enacted, across Europe and across Eurasia, in a certain part of the world, and where there always seemed to be conflict, Europe, and that's what the Americans would always say. They'd always say, "Oh, why fight a war in Europe? They're always fighting some sort of war." So there were a significant amount of people in America that were willing to ignore the human rights abuses, even when news of it, although very early news of it, and very ominous, very foreboding. But what eventually happened was not made obviously clear to the majority of people back in, let's say, 1940 or 1939. And so the warnings of the actions that would be taken later on during World War II in 42, 43, 44, 45, they it wasn't real enough for the American people. But anyway, once we'd gotten into the war, we'd recognized just how bad the situation was. And we'd gotten into the war because of, again, being attacked ourselves. In World War One, people don't know too much about it, but it was Germany's enactment of unrestricted submarine warfare, and where they could sink any ship in the Atlantic. So whether it be American or Dutch or French or Brazilian or or Cuban, they were going to shoot it down, so or they would tow it over to a nearby German occupied port, which actually was impossible because they were blockaded. So they would just shoot down every single ship they saw in the Atlantic. And for America, that was unacceptable. And we all know about Pearl Harbor, which led us into World War II. But anyway, once the decision had already been made to cast off neutrality, most of the damage had already been done. And few know this more than Churchill, who, summing up the events leading up to American intervention in both world wars, said once that, quote, "You can depend on the Americans to do the right thing, but only after they have exhausted every other possibility," end quote. America doesn't want to interfere. It really doesn't. If it doesn't deem it absolutely necessary and deems the cost of not acting is worse than watching from a distance. In his famous Iron Curtain speech, also commonly known as the Sinews of Peace. You can look it up that way as well because it's known as both titles. He echoed the sentiment that, quote, "Twice in our own lifetime, we have seen the United States against their wishes and their traditions, against arguments the force of which it is impossible not to comprehend, drawn by irresistible forces into these wars in times to secure the victory of the good cause, but only after frightful slaughter and devastation had occurred," end quote. Because America doesn't want war. Whether America wants it or not, with the great power it has on the world stage, responsibility is expanded far beyond their borders. If you have power, use it for good, or at least in fighting off a greater evil. I believe, despite our flaws and many events that led many to consider our national history as Americans as spotty, we succeeded in the goal better than any other in history of balancing peace and freedom, for better or for worse.
Yeah, very good sentiment there. You could see, once again, as Churchill, the one who had to rely on American assistance throughout, like the Battle of Berlin in 1940, through constant bombings, missiles, attacks every single day, every single night, who had to go watch the United States sit over there, argue through all their problems, to finally get involved after all the damage had been done. And again, it just shows that at the end of the day, while we do support our ideas of freedom and democracy, war isn't always the avenue that us Americans want to go along with. War, of course, well, we've seen how it does have its benefits, to the economy, to the industries. Military-industrial complex gets a shout out. But at the end of the day, justifying to our citizens that we need to send our 18, 19-year-olds to go die on the fields of Flanders in France is not exactly something that's easy for us to do. We Americans don't always want war. We don't always want to go get involved and send our people out to die because even though we support these systems, sometimes it's just not the best thing to do. Well, sometimes it is the best thing to do, but sometimes we just don't realize it. However, when these great atrocities happen, and sometimes it takes us getting hit at home, like Pearl Harbor, for us to, really wake us out of our sleep. Sometimes it takes that for us to get involved. But when we do, we will go all in. Because at the end of the day, we do support these ideas of freedom and democracies. We will defend our other democratic nations from autocratic regimes or other nations who seek to destroy the freedoms that they and we share. We will do that once we're involved, but we are not always war hungry and out there ready to start a fight. But when we are, we will go in.
So, as Kennedy was sworn into office in 1961, from the earliest of his political career, but especially as he was getting ready for his presidential run, and during his presidential term, he was always being criticized for being light on the Soviets, for being light on the Reds, for being a commie lover. So in 1963, with the series of crises that happened leading up to it, with the construction of the Berlin Wall, with the Cuban Missile Crisis, with the Checkpoint Charlie crisis, which we'd all talked about. which we talked about. Every single one of those events, shout out to the nuclear deterrence series. By 1963, Kennedy was getting ready for his speech. June 26th, 1963, in fact, where he, very similarly to what Reagan did in 1987 with his Tear Down This Wall speech, he went to, I believe he actually went to West Berlin, yeah. And
He was in
he,
Berlin to give
yeah,
this speech in front of the German people. Um, Once again, as Reagan would go on to do the same 20 or so years later, but he went to Berlin, he went to West Berlin to give a speech in support once again in democracy and to show that he wasn't as soft as on the communists as, the media and people wanted him or wanted to paint him as. So you could continue if you want.
I'm just gonna let you go for it.
Sure. Yeah. And so with this speech, you have what we'll come to explain it is again more explanation on the support of liberalism and how it won't always be perfect, but again, it does a much better job at balancing the freedoms and the ideas that we value. To start off, an excerpt. Freedom has many difficulties, and democracy is not perfect, but we have never had to put up a wall to keep people in or to prevent them from leaving us. I want to say, on behalf of my countrymen who live many miles away on the other side of the Atlantic, who are far distant from you, that they take the greatest pride that they have been able to share with you, even from a distance, the story of the last 18 years. I know of no town, no city, that has been besieged for 18 years and still lives with the vitality, the force, and the hope and the determination of the city of West Berlin. While the wall is the most obvious and vivid demonstration of the failures of the communist system, for all the world to see, we take no satisfaction in it. Um, as your mayor has said, and no offense to only an offense not only against history, but an offense against humanity, separating families, dividing husbands and wives and brothers and sisters, and dividing a people who wish to be joined together. End quote. Is a longer quote, of course, but we'll pick this apart. But what you have is while democracy, as he starts it out saying, freedom, democracy, the liberal system is not always perfect. At the same time, the United States was beginning or in the middle of the civil rights movement of African Americans like Khalil and I fighting for our rights, fighting for them to be enforced, our constitutional rights to be enforced by our government because it had been failing to do so. We were not perfect. America is not perfect. Britain's not perfect. West Germany, France, they are not perfect. But we have never had to build a wall separating, Washington D.C. from like Baltimore or anything because we can't deal with the fact that people at the other side of that wall have something that we don't. We do not have to separate our families, our husbands, our wives, our brothers from each other because we can't deal with the fact that others have freedom and we don't. The communist system, it's just as Kenny described it, it is a it is a offense not only to history but an offense to humanity because a wall falls at it divides us from the core principle that we hold dear at our hearts, and that is freedom. And again, as we described from the very beginning of this series, freedom is something that we as humans have intrinsic to who we are, to the species. It's what sets us different from all the animals in the jungles and the oceans and in the air, is that we have this freedom, this self-determination to be, to choose, to act, to think. And so we have these ideas, and a wall that separates one society from another just shows how incompatible the system who made that wall, the communist system, is to our very base humanity, in that it can't even recognize that we have the freedoms of belief, of religion, of living where we so choose, that a government has to separate us from this because it can't tolerate the us humans having it. It shows that system has failed. It is an affront to our humanity to have a wall like Berlin. and it is a great blessing that it was felt that the communists would come to realize this. But that the whole wall dividing these systems again just shows what a failure that kind of autocratic system is.
That's the thing. Utopias fail. Utopias in real life society, they do not work. In the communist system, it is a weak system. Why would you be so scared of joining families and uniting peoples if you knew that people didn't want your system? And not just the German people, but people in general. The people living under the Soviet Union, it's hard to believe that they really could have been happy. Just in the same way how right now in Russia, when you get those public polls saying that 85% of the people support Putin, or those mock elections that they probably have in North Korea, where 99% of the people support Kim Jong Un. It's like they're not real. They're not free. They're fake. So it's a weak system, and then it also makes no sense because it really shows you again utopias fail. Marx, oh my god, true communists want complete freedom. That's the point. That is the problem with communism, is that if they want complete freedom. But where is that gone? With the Berlin Wall. They lift up a wall to unite the people, they get rid of their freedom, shoot anyone that speaks against it, like machine guns 6-year-olds or 12-year-olds, or a desperate wife or husband that wants to see their other side of their family, from
Yeah,
crossing the wall, and
it's
so
like they want it's like they want complete freedom through complete peace, which
it
makes zero sense. You have to
makes
keep
no
in
sense.
order to have this complete freedom of reaching the utopic society where we have no government and we all just help each other. We need a government that will follow us behind every corner or shoot us if we try to go somewhere else. That
That's the
that doesn't how does that get us to complete freedom? That it doesn't make sense. It's a
it's
failure
like
because you
I'm
you
sure.
can't just go to complete peace and then think you'll magically go waltz back to complete freedom. You think it's a means to an end. It isn't, because you don't go back. You don't go back to that complete freedom that you're hoping for. The Marxist idea seems fine because at the end of the day, it is that complete freedom, which, is what humanity had, is what we have as what's again separates us from the animals. This freedom to choose and to act. And so, ideally, we could have this complete freedom and be peaceful. That's great. But in order to reach that, we have to have a dictatorial autocratic regime which polices everything we think and do and act and where we go. I don't really trust that it's going to get us there. It sounds great, doesn't work.
That's the thing. It take look at common sense. If you give too much power, they will take your life, your everything that comes with the happiness of your life. Like in 1984 or other totalitarian societies like China. The people they did not want like the clique chaos that existed between the White Ping Revolution in 1911 and the rise of the CCP in 1949 after the Chinese Civil War. They didn't want that sort of chaos, but they hated the Kuomintang, the nationalist Chinese that were fighting the communists during the Civil War. They had people that they hated, and so they were willing to give up their freedom, to fight in that conflict against the lesser evil, which they believed to be the communists. And little did they know, but the communists ended up being the people that would get rid of their freedom. That's what the Tiananmen Square massacre was about. People that recognized, the children of those or the grandchildren of those that fought, for the communists back during the Civil War. They realized we don't want this. We don't want this. But because they gave so much of their power, to do good over to the government because they trusted them, they proved that they weren't worth their trust. So that's why you always need to keep government at an arm's length. I guess the interesting thing is that people who have read the Communist Manifesto or people that have read Das Kapital are very surely they're educated. They know what they're talking about, sure, but up until the point where they say that it's a good system. Okay, because they're reading it and they're not realizing what really can be interpreted as what's going on in Marx's mind, because they see it, they're like, oh, that's so perfect. People, they have peace and they have freedom. That's so great. Because it's an attempted balance. It's an attempt at some sort of utopia. It's been practiced by Plato, it's been practiced by Thomas More, and then Marx was no different. It's just that when you believe that that system is actually possible in the real world, it's not going to work. People that have a convincing teacher that may tell them that anarchy and communism and utopia like ideals are possible in the real life world, they kind of lost touch with the real world. They lost touch with reality. They're now in fantasy land because like original sin. It's not just in the Bible, it's real life. Look around. Realize that if you give people too much freedom, they go crazy. If you give governments too much freedom to do what you want with people, they will go crazy. It's like it is a common thing amongst humans. We must be reined in somehow, so you have to have a balance. You can't have both completely. That's why communism failed. And the Soviet system is an example of what happens when you have like thinkers, political thinkers, philosophers like Marx that want a utopia, because communism, which was supposed to get rid of all institutional systems, it wasn't thought through. There was no plan for governance. There was no plan for tax collection, the law, necessary things, and the specificity of that transition from capitalism to socialism and communism. It wasn't outlined. It was just supposed to be that the people would revolt. They would all agree on on what direction that revolt would take them, and then they would go to some sort of socialist society as a transition over to the communist society, withering away the state power, that people would start to see themselves as like forever together. And the Comintern showed that the people, the Bolsheviks, that provoked and like led this revolution in Russia in 1917, the first practice of Marxism, that actually somewhat succeeded, into like taking over a country. They wanted this to be an international project, which I don't even think would have worked then. It would have set the world back 20, 30,000, maybe 50,000 years to the beginning of, to before civilization had even been practiced, to a pre civilizational humankind gap in where there is no order at all. And that would
Yeah,
have been chaos. So
yeah,
utopia fail. And Marx is a perfect example of that. The Soviets took the power that people gave them and went crazy with it. So
yeah.
don't trust it.
Oh yeah. As we kind of finish out this little point we want to make, that's the problem with believing in this whole Marxist communist idea. Because sure, the end goal sounds fine. We get to live in this peace, we get to work with each other. There's no government to oppress us, there's no capitalists taking our work gains, all of this. Cool. We all have human rights. That's great. But the whole pathway that they're supposed to get to that is nonsense. You don't give a government absolute power and just kind of cross your fingers that they're just gonna give it back. That doesn't make sense. You give the Russian Revolution, yeah, you give the Bolsheviks this state power so that ideally they're gonna transform the state into one that could be suitable for the Marxist system, for the communist system of people having no state. Okay, cool. It's been 10 years. Why haven't they given up the state, their power? Why is Lenin still there? Why is Stalin still there? Something's not adding up. Why is the government still here? That's their purpose, to just go away, right? No. You give that people that power, they're not gonna give it up. It's crazy, since Marxists very much recognize how power can corrupt in a capitalist system, and if for some reason they seem to be very blind in how it could be corrupted in their own system, in the socialist system, which has been very, 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 very obvious. And so it kind of befuddles us that it's still a working ideology. Not the end goal, but the fact that you could believe that you could get to it through giving the power, the absolute power, to a socialist autocratic government who hopefully will give it back. It's just kind of nonsense. Um, Anyways, we'll get back again to Kennedy's speech, in which, again, he pointed out how it's a failure when your system has to set apart a wall between your quote unquote free people and the other free people of the world. It kind of shows that, once again, someone's not really free. And so with that, we'll follow up with another quote near the end of Kennedy's speech in Berlin that continues with this idea. Quote, freedom is indivisible, and when one man is enslaved, all are not free. When all are free, then we can look forward to that day when the city, Berlin, will be joined as one in this country and the great continent of Europe in a peaceful and hopeful globe. End quote. Freedom is indivisible, and when one man is enslaved, all are not free. What does this mean? When there are people who are not free in this global world, because once again, all of our countries don't live in a vacuum. The United States is not the only country on the planet. The Soviet Union isn't the only country on the planet. We all live, we're all still humans. We're all still on this planet Earth, and so our issues still do matter to one another, no matter if we're just on the other side of an ocean. If some people are not free, and we sit over there in our freedom, gloating about it, doing nothing to help them achieve the freedom that intrinsically they still do want, while they might not want the American system, they probably still want a system in which they could decide the government for their own self-determination, as you've heard it. Well, if we just stayed over here with our freedom and keep it to ourselves, what's the difference between just making a wall between our country and everyone else in the world, just as the communists did? It's that it makes just as little sense as that does. If one man is if uh, if one man is enslaved, all are not free. In this idea, you have the idea that as long as people are in bondage under autocratic regimes, under dictatorial regimes, as long as they don't have that freedom that we have and can give to them, if they want it, then, like I said, it's just as pointless as making an entire wall around ourselves and keeping that freedom to ourselves, just like the communists did.
So, as we talk about the idea of one man not being free, so none are free, and we're getting close to time, but we just quickly want to introduce the idea that we're going to expand a lot more on in our final episode, or maybe two episodes, the way this is going, of our Peace v Freedom series, which we are going to call. Um, um, I think it was actually called what did we choose on
Begin
calling?
the world over again.
Perfect. Perfect name. Yeah, so before we get over to that series, we're just going to give a quick summarized description of what that series is going to be about. Because as we talk about Kennedy's quote, freedom is indivisible, and when one man is enslaved, all are not free, that really is the highlight of international law. You know, we saw that quote from Teddy Roosevelt back in 1904, saying that international law was weak, you know, that someone needed to enforce international law, and who it was, that was a big question. Now, in Teddy Roosevelt's mind, it had to be America because they had amongst the biggest economies in the world, and very soon it would be the biggest economy in the world. And it had the biggest military. It had the most freedom. It balanced peace and freedom best than any other system in the world. And so, like, once the UN is created, it was supposed to be a system of which the US did not need to act as that power, you know, but with the way that the UN is set up, it is supposed to draft and enforce international law. But because it makes international law a democratic process in and of itself, but more of a major of a
It
it's
seems to act as if a majority were to rule, but there are systems in it that a single country could overrule dozens and hundreds of other countries' decision making. And so the whole idea um, if one man isn't free, then no one is free. If that's the case, we have someone to enforce that. And if the United Nations can't do that, someone does. And then we'll come to see this idea evolve of who that wants to be. And in some of them, as you can see, it's the United States, if not the liberal orders of society. And so with that, we're going to end out this one. We are the Marshals of Truth, and we'll see you in the next episode.